ka pai. Well, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou katoa, kua tūhono mai ki tēnei, te hui tahi kia whakarewa hia, ka whakatauka o te PISA, o tēnei o te tau kua huri. Nei rā te mihi atu kia koutou katoa. It's wonderful to be able to formally welcome everybody to this webinar and to all those people that have participated and are ready for a discussion on the PISA results for 2022. Ko tēnei te reo mihi o EPIT o tēnei rōpū e kōkiri ana I ka kaupapa hei hiki I te mana o ka kai tauira aha ko e noho ana kihea I te motu Aotearoa. I'm extending the mihi and the welcome from EPIT, the organisation, Education Partnership and Innovation Trust, to all of you who have joined with us today. And it's an organisation that is committed to raising levels of achievement, but also it's about equity in education for all those in Aotearoa. And with that in mind, I'm going to start us off with a karakia, and then I will turn to the other co-chair of EPIT, my dear friend Lorraine Mentz, who will give a brief introduction. So would you join with me in a moment where we start with a karakia, and then I will pass over to Lorraine. Kia inoi tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. And with those words of karakia, of prayer, we simply call on the elements, the winds and the winds to the coast, the winds to the land, and we call on the elements and the environment around us to centre us in this moment in time. And as the karakia says, we have a touch of frost. I'm in the South Island. There might be a bit more of a touch of frost in other places today, but with a touch of frost and the coolness of the air, a new dawn is rising, and we celebrate the new dawn and a new beginning and a new day. And we do that together with Aroha, and we do that together today on this webinar. So with that, I will now turn to you, Lorraine. Kei a koe te wā e te rakatira.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Hannah. Tēnā tātou, ko Lorraine Mentz taku ingoa. I have the enormous privilege of co-chairing EPIT with Hannah. As Hannah mentioned, we're an organisation that is focused on addressing inequity through transformative partnerships and really driving a thriving, equitable Aotearoa New Zealand for all learners. I met with Andreas in July in Paris, and he very kindly suggested that he would join us and host the launch of New Zealand's results. So we put up our hands as EPIT to assist in that, and we're absolutely thrilled. And thank you, Andreas. Working with you and your team has really been inspirational. I'd also like to thank the panelists, Soana Pamaka, Derek Wenmouth, Hannah Longley, and Grant Pollard, who joining us this morning for some additional commentary. But also really would like to thank the educationalists. I know there are hundreds of you on this webinar for the incredible work that you do for all our learners. And we really look forward as an Education Partnership and Innovation Trust to supporting you and joining you in the incredible work that you do. So thank you so much. We're very excited. I'd like now to hand over to Jane for the housekeeping for the webinar and how things will run further on. Jane's the ED of EPIT. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Lorraine. Jane Treadwell-Hoy, Executive Director of EPIT, and the format we are taking this morning is Andreas will present the results, and we're really looking forward to seeing his slides. And then I will facilitate a panel discussion, and we will open up the Q&A so that we actually have an opportunity to deep dive a little into these results and have a conversation about what it means for education in Aotearoa. Those of you who are on the call would have seen the caveat at the beginning. This is being recorded. There are people who are unable to attend. But if you've got any questions, just please raise them in the chat and the Q&A. Thank you. Andreas, I shall hand over to you, and welcome to Aotearoa. Good evening to you in Paris.
Thank you and good morning. It's a real pleasure to join you here and share a little bit of what we found from PISA, but also I look forward to our discussion on what those results could mean for New Zealand. I'll just share my presentation. PISA is the largest global assessment of learning outcomes. It's really an effort to put countries on a level playing field and see, what we can learn from and with each other when it comes to education. We took the largest PISA assessment, right after the pandemic in 22, with around 690,000 students and with also some newcomers. We focused on mathematics, and since this PISA is not a traditional test of mathematics knowledge, but really looks at mathematical competency, I want to just briefly explain what I mean by this and what students had to do to be successful on this. First of all, had to look at real problems from the world. We started most of our tasks not with, formulas and equations, but students had to, solve or get familiar with a real problem. And then they had to solve that problem with mathematical concepts and then make sense of mathematical solutions back in the real world. And some of the problems involved quantitative reasoning, things like number sense, judging interpretations, arguments based on quantity. Other problems were more about statistics and data. Still others involved change, relationships. Some were about space and shape. And all of those problems were framed in context from the very personal through the social to the scientific, and then also required cross-cutting 21st century skills, things like critical thinking, creativity, self-direction. And actually, if you want to get a feel for all of this, there's a lot of sample tasks on our website. But I want to talk about some of the results. The last PISA assessment focused on mathematics, and since 2003, we have been looking at mathematics. And our world has changed a lot since then. As you can see, our chart, the kind of mathematical reasoning you need today is actually quite different from what was sufficient in 2003. Some things got a lot easier. Technology is becoming much better to take over mathematical routines, but other things got harder. If you want to understand climate change or a pandemic, you need to have a good understanding of exponentials. You need to be able to distinguish signal from noise. You need to be able to think in terms of probabilities, things that we didn't give much attention to 20 years ago. The trouble is that across OECD countries, PISA shows really that the mathematical competencies have not progressed. In fact, over the last years, they have quite steeply declined. In a way, in New Zealand, even more so than on average across countries. New Zealand used to be one of the top performers, and then since recently followed more or less a trend that we've seen across OECD countries. When you look at the last dip, 2018-22, that's 15 score points. That's 3/4 of a school year. So it's actually quite a significant drop. You might think that's all about the pandemic, but I think that's at best part of the story. Well, the good thing is that while overall things got worse, there are a number of countries that have backed the trend and seen actually quite good progress over the last decade. You can see Singapore moving from good to great, keeping advancing even during the pandemic, or Macau, Japan, Estonia. You have Portugal, Hungary, Israel, making good progress, but falling a bit back. Turkey, very interesting, moving forward, and also getting a lot more young people enrolled in school. They had very poor enrollment back in 2003 and really advanced this a lot. Romania, Moldova in Europe, and then at the lower end, you can see countries like Qatar. Nobody had them on the radar screen moving forward, or Peru, Colombia, also relatively poor countries making progress, or Brazil. Expanding access again, like Turkey, getting a lot more people into the system, and at the same time, raising quality. So unfortunately, we don't have so many success stories, but there's some really, and they get you to the league tables that you then find in the media. But I want to bring one more dimension into this picture, and that is, social background. Let me take, New Zealand, put it there, and show you the gap between the most disadvantaged and the wealthiest students. And you can see actually that is a sizable gap. It's almost, the world it spans. So you come from a wealthy background, you do as well as Japan and Korea and all these countries. You come from a disadvantaged background, you're more like Brazil or Colombia or Jamaica. No? And that really, I think, thinks, can we do better than this? And interestingly is when you look at comparably disadvantaged students in Switzerland, they do a lot better than the disadvantaged in New Zealand. And if you look at comparably disadvantaged students in Macau, they almost get to the top of the distribution in New Zealand. So think about this. The poorest kids in Macau doing pretty much as well as the wealthiest in New Zealand. And that really, I think, shows us that poverty need not be destiny, that in the right context, actually children from all backgrounds can succeed. And in a way, that is the big promise of education, of a good education. We don't see many countries delivering that, but some. And I think that's really important. You can look at the social gap in relation to the gender gap. The social gap is the green diamond, the gender gap is the blue diamond. And in most countries, education has dealt quite well with gender differences in mathematics. If you look to New Zealand, boys and girls pretty much have the same performance. It's not true at the top end of the distribution, but more or less. But the social gap remains wide. And then you go to the left side where you can actually see in some countries, it's getting even wider. So sort of dealing with social disparities has really been tough for education. And we haven't seen much progress. In the pandemic, in fact, in a number of countries, things got worse. I want to bring one more way of looking at inequality, and that, schools can differ in their performance. You can see that here by the length of the blue bar, high and low performing school, but also student performance can differ inside schools. And that is the green bar. And when you look at New Zealand, it's really interesting. Many people focus on, school standards and school comparisons and school choice and things like that. But actually, in the case of New Zealand, schools don't differ very much in their performance. The bigger issue is under the radar screen. It's the green bar. The performance variation inside school is far, far bigger than the differences that we observe between schools. That's very different, if you are in the Netherlands or the Slovak Republic. There you can say, actually, choosing the right school is really, really important. In New Zealand is much more about, addressing underperformance within the school. And that's much harder to do policy-wise, because, you need to diagnose those. If everything is about, poor kids in poor neighborhoods, then you can easily deal with that. But if sort of performance variation is huge within schools, that's actually much harder to deal with. And that's clearly the challenge in New Zealand. You're a small country and you see huge variability in learning outcomes within schools. And not all of that is about social background. No? You can look to Estonia. Estonia is one of the top performers in PISA, as I already said, and you can see actually every school in Estonia succeeds. No? Variation in performance is even smaller. Or Iceland, the closest school is always the best school. So I think this is a really important, angle to look at that. It's not about schools, it's really about student performance within schools. Now, using resources, the first thing that we always think about is money and education. But, if we're honest, actually, the relationship between spending and outcomes is very tenuous. New Zealand doesn't invest that much per student, but even if you look at what it invests, you can say it's pretty much in an area where, spending more will not necessarily guarantee better outcomes. You can see, for example, Singapore and Qatar spend roughly the same and have hugely different outcomes. Or, Vietnam and the Philippines, hugely different outcomes with similar spending. Or you can look at it the other way around, Vietnam spends a lot less than New Zealand and has comparable outcomes. And so money, is necessary, But, what matters a lot more is how those resources are deployed. And what you can say for New Zealand is often that schools in disadvantage also have, more teacher shortages, more material shortage resources. So in a way, you achieve almost the opposite. What you would want to have is that you attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, get the best school leaders into the toughest schools. And that's really, I think, a challenge in the case of New Zealand. There's also an interesting point about, how do we use learning time? You can see here that number of hours that students spend learning per week in school, that's the blue bar, and the number of hours they spend learning out of school, the green bar. And there are huge differences. Now, in Morocco, students spend 50 hours learning per week. In Switzerland, it's less than 30 hours. But when you look at productivity, you can actually see that learning gains per hour of instruction, that Switzerland and also New Zealand are doing really well. Students don't spend a lot of time in school, but what they do, they learn actually quite fast. And that, I think, sort of points to actually quite good instructional environment. But I want to sort of highlight a few points. We can see that principals often complain about a shortage of education staff. And actually, in New Zealand, there are more complaints in 22 than there were in 2018, suggesting things might get a little bit worse. But when I look at actual student-staff ratios, they have remained the same. So it's interesting that school principals complain more about staff shortages, but we cannot see that in the actual data. But anyway, what you can see is also that staff shortages can matter. Mathematics performance is quite a bit lower in countries in which principals talked about a lack of teaching staff or inadequate or poorly qualified staff. The same holds for assistant staff, education material, physical infrastructure, lack or inadequacy of digital resources. Now, some of that is, explained by a social background, but overall, you can really say that, where schools face lack of resources, that is typically also mirrored in lower performance. So once again, aligning resource versus needs is really critically important to achieve, more equitable outcomes. I want to talk a little bit about, digital resources. During the pandemic, schools woke up to this digital world. That's very clear. And when you look at actually the outcomes, you can see that students spend quite a bit of time on digital resources inside school, and then also for learning, and then also for leisure. Now, when you compare that with the length of the school day, you can see it's a pretty large share of learning time that is now spent digitally. In a way, the digital world has become the real world for students. Now, if you are in Ukraine, you spend more time on digital resources than you spend time in school. And that's, of course, because schools are closed because of the war. But there are other countries in that situation as well. And New Zealand really is at the high end of that. Now, the question, of course, is that time online a good thing or a bad thing? And it really depends on how the technology is used. When technology is used for learning, you can see the relationship between hours of technology use and math performance is largely flat. No? But when technology is used for leisure, students using their smartphones and tablets, you can actually see steeply declining learning outcomes. And that really, I think, is a wake-up call. It's not that technology is good or bad, but you can really see for some users, it can be extremely productive, but actually it can also be a drag of student learning. And I will talk in a moment of many, many other things as well. I want to talk about the digital world from another perspective. You can see students' confidence in self-directed learning, where, I was actually quite struck. On the one hand, when I look at students in New Zealand, they don't seem to have difficulties using a video communication program. But when we ask them, are you motivated to do schoolwork on your own, there New Zealand has one of the lowest figures. And that really, I think, is an important outcome, because, it's not just in a pandemic where you need to learn on your own, but in today's world, if you think about upskilling, reskilling, all of those things later in life, people need to take a lot more ownership over what they learn and how they learn and when they learn and where they learn. And I do think this is a real challenge for education. Too often we make learners, passive consumers of prefabricated content. And the challenge really is to create an environment where students, develop more agency and more capacity to learn on their own. And clearly that is a challenge for New Zealand in comparison with other countries. But again, let's get back to the question whether technology can impair learning. And what is quite clear is that, technology can be very destructive. Here you can see the share of students who said that, they get distracted by the digital devices or by other students using digital devices. You can see New Zealand is among the countries where that happens most. Not as much as in Argentina, Uruguay, or Chile, but still, it comes pretty close to that. So that's something to think about, to what extent, technology becomes an obstacle to learning. We can also see, real dependencies. We ask students whether they feel nervous or anxious when they don't have their phone near them. And you can see, Turkey and Malaysia, where this is now almost 70%. Why do I say that? Because the data show that where students feel anxious when they don't have their phones, they do a lot less well in mathematics, and they're also less happy with their lives. They have a harder time managing themselves. They are less resistant to stress. In fact, when students use their smartphone at school in most mathematics lessons, they were 1.4 times as likely to be distracted than students who did not. So what can we do about it? We didn't find much of a difference in students being distracted when schools had some, written policy, or when teachers established rules for the devices. That doesn't seem to be particularly effective. The only thing that is clearly linked to less distractions was a ban on smartphones at school, as indicated here by the red bar. But at the same time, you can ban it, but you also want students to get familiar with those technologies. So I think it's a real dilemma and really requires us to think about. Let's get back to teachers. During the pandemic, it, I think, became abundantly clear that learning is never a transactional business, but always a social, always a relational experience. And I know your foundation takes that really to heart. And I actually think New Zealand is doing quite well on that. When you look at the share of students, you can see in Vietnam, 9 out of 10 students said their teachers were available when they needed help. And actually, New Zealand also is doing quite well on that students really felt that during the pandemic, there was, teachers were available to them. Where, I would put a little bit more caveat when we ask students, in the pandemic, did someone call you and ask how you are? There, the percentages for New Zealand are very low. We're talking about, I think it's like 13, 14%. So most of the relationship was about instruction, material, and so on, but there was actually a lot less attention to the well-being of students than in some other countries. Good. Why does this matter? What you see here is that when students felt that their teachers were available when they needed help during the pandemic, so students were more confident in learning on their own. And you saw how important that is. And where students felt their teachers were available, they also scored roughly a school year better. And when we look more closely into that, we found that even countries where teacher support improved over those last 4 years, those were also generally the ones where mathematics performance improved. We asked students how they were supported during the pandemic. And what you can see is that on average across countries, half of the students were offered live virtual classes, got material on learning platforms, assignments, and that seemed to be working well. But what's more troubling is that just 13% of students had someone to check in with them how they were feeling. And less than 20% that they received tips how to study on their own. And in some countries, it went below 10%. Why do I say that? Because, you can see that those actions by school had a really significant positive impact on students' capacity for self-directed learning here on the left side. And they were also associated with less mathematics anxiety on the right side. And those effects were particularly pronounced for girls and particularly pronounced for disadvantaged. So you can really see how those school actions can become a lever from a level playing field. I talked about teachers, but parents are another very important part of the learning ecosystem. And here, New Zealand is not doing so well. Here you see the share of schools where principals said at least half of the parents take real initiatives to discuss their child's progress with the teacher. You can see in the Philippines, Vietnam, Kazakhstan, that is very common. In Norway, it is very rare, and in New Zealand also, it is not very common. And in most countries, actually, parental engagement has declined. In New Zealand, that difference is not statistically significant, but the trend clearly goes in the wrong direction of parents taking less responsible, less engagement, and schools doing less to sort of approach parents. Now, that does not necessarily mean that parents are not interested in education, because if I look at this chart, in the case of New Zealand, actually at home, parents seem to care about education. They actually ask their students, how was school, all of those things. And we see that that has a bigger impact on learning outcomes than parental income. So it doesn't seem to be a lack of interest on the part of parents in education, but a lack of relationship between school and families. At least, that's my reading of this data. You obviously know the context much, much better in New Zealand. And that brings me to, the issue of student well-being. We ask students how happy they were with their life. And you might think for 15-year-olds, the last thing that will make them happy is their school. It's all about friends. It's all about social relationships. But look at this data. Number one, the quality of relationships with their parents. Number two, the life at school. Now, well-being of 15-year-olds is very closely related to what we do in educational institutions. So it's really worth looking at the experience of students at school with that in mind. And, one aspect that schools can clearly shape is whether school is a place where students feel they belong, where they make friends, where they don't feel lonely, and so on. And you can see Austria and Switzerland are doing really well on that. New Zealand more on the, problem end. The data show that school safety as well as teacher support were actually very important here. Does it matter? Actually, there is a good cross-country relationship. No, this is a different story. Before, there is also a good cross-country relationship between those things. But here is a different story. We also were interested whether students develop a growth mindset. Here represented on the horizontal axis. Now in Estonia, students see the sky is the limit. They trust when they work hard, that teachers will help them, they will be successful. So that's the kind of mindset that is, productive. In Albania, students often believe their success depends on the intelligence they were born with. And you can see actually that kind of mindset is quite closely correlated with academic achievement. Last set of factors, we can see where students were more curious, where they were more persistent, where they showed greater emotional control, greater stress resistance. Those were also really good predictors for mathematics performance. At the other end of student well-being is bullying. We looked at that as well. And you can see here on average across countries, 1 in 5 students had heard a student threaten to hurt another student. Some countries it was half. 1 in 10 saw a student carrying a gun or a knife. And actually, when you look at this across countries, you can see huge variability in this. Now, students in Switzerland and Austria felt really safe. Students in Jamaica and Cambodia a lot less so. And you can see also in New Zealand, school safety is a bit of an issue now. And as you can imagine, students who felt less safe, they were less happy with their life, they felt a lower sense of belonging, less capacity for self-directed learning, and greater anxiety with mathematics. Finally, we looked at student absenteeism, and it got better since 2018. That's encouraging news. But what's interesting, look at this, the third most common reason that students cited for long-term absenteeism was that they got bored. So that's certainly something education should be able to do something about. And with that, I stop so that we have enough time for our discussion. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, thank you, Andreas. There have been a huge number of questions that have come through in the Q&A. One of the first ones I think to look at is, there was a comment you made at the very beginning about PISA measuring real life skills, and Rob was just wondering, is this done in a written test in one language, or is it tested in some other way?
Well, the language is adapted to the students, but the assessment is computer-based. So students may have to design an experiment or do an experiment on the computer. It's not a kind of we try to avoid kind of traditional multiple choice tasks where you have to prefabricate the answer. We try to give students, some problem to solve where they have to, drag and drop things. That's basically the nature of the assessment.
So Anna, as principal of Tamaki College, you are seeing the whānau engagement and the ainga engagement within the school community. How do you see that from a relationship perspective? Because those last few slides show the impact of family on student achievement.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. And I just wanted to make the comment that looking at that presentation, I feel like there is so much expectation on our school to problem solve all of these things that have been identified that are impacting on the achievement of a student, which I guess leads us to the resourcing matter, but I won't go there right now. I'll answer your question. So yes, our families are very much a part of the learning journey of our young people. That's a difficult relational space to live in for us in our community, but we have to work hard in that space, which is in our cultures, it's called VAR, which is that give and take relational space that we earn the trust of our community by doing what we need to do in that space. I also wanted to say that the information that's been gathering through the survey, the PISA, by the time our students get to probably question 17, Andre, they'll be feeling a little bit lacking because those questions are making assumptions about the lives of our young people. So when you say, what does your mother do? There's a significant number of our young people don't live with their mother or their father. They may be living with a grandmother or a auntie, uncle, older sibling. So, and asking those questions, I think it's my suggestion that you need to review those because there's a sense of lacking that my young people will get by the time they get to question 17. And also the question about the activities, those activities may be foreign to my young people. So it's about their well-being and it's about presenting their families in a positive light because their reality might be different from what you're expecting through your questioning. So families, our young people are very loyal to their families and they defend them in any way they can. So if they get the sense that their mother, they're not living with their mother, they're living with their grandmother who hasn't been to university, we work hard as a school to talk about pathways. So they'll be familiar with universities and degrees because our careers department and Gateway people work hard with them, but their families may not be modeling what you're suggesting to them in that survey. So yes, Jane, working with our families, very important part of our work. It's not easy, but we go there because we need them on board with the learning journey of their young people. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the other questions that came up in the chat was the variability seemed to be around the capability of teachers, and one of the questions from was how are countries increasingly addressing this need for consistency in the teaching profession? Any of the panelists or Andreas, have you seen anything?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And when you look at countries that do that well, basically they don't achieve that through top-down instruction, but establishing a really strong collaborative culture in education. I mean, Japanese, Chinese teachers are great at that. They do lesson study, they observe each other's lessons carefully, they learn from each other, they do experiments. There's actually a lot of research on the part of teachers going into ensuring what works best in what context and to make practice consistent. You have a really strong ownership in the profession for professional practice. It's less coming from teacher training institutions and pre-service training and a lot more coming from the kind of culture in the school that really fosters on collaboration. We also actually know that that's one of the drivers of teacher job satisfaction. Our survey shows that spend more time, somebody does classes, spend more time on collaborative professional development and things like this. They generally tend to be more interested in their jobs and happier with their jobs. So consistency really through collaborative practice. I think that's my take on that.
Derek, one of the results that are showing through this research is the variability within the school context. So you've got high performers and low performers, but the trend globally has been a downward trend across numeracy, science and literacy. What do you think this currently reflects about the way we're currently educating our kids?
Sorry, kia ora, Jane. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a big question, and it's one that I'm sure concerns a lot of people. And I think Andreas's point at the beginning is a clue to a piece of this for me when he said they have been creating increasingly sort of sophisticated or change in the assessment to reflect the changes that are happening in society. And for me, I think there's a lot more investigation needed to look at this overall downward trend in these PISA and OECD results that are ostensibly reflecting what education's outcomes are in terms of preparing kids for their future and to thrive in that future world. But you can't do that separate from thinking, so what are these big trends and patterns that are happening in the world in which we live, and how are these being reflected in the education policy and practice? Because I think Andreas's last point about building the culture of our teaching profession at that local level, increased collaboration and solving these problems at that level needs to be where a lot of our attention goes. And I do have a concern about the quick fix, one-off from the top solutions that we keep finding coming out of responses to things like this, which only end up putting our teachers under more and more pressure and become a distraction, if you like, for them.
Thank you. Hannah, if you don't mind me asking, in your practice as a psychotherapist and the work that you do with your trust and young people, whilst the global trend shows bullying is in decline, it's still showing somewhere between 43 and 47% of children are experiencing bullying on a regular basis at school. And the New Zealand results showed that New Zealand 15-year-olds didn't necessarily think of school as a safe place or somewhere they felt comfortable in. How's that turning up for you, and what are you seeing in the trends in your practice?
Yeah, we see a lot of bullying happening. Like, there's a lot of reasons that kids are struggling with school, and bullying is a component of that. I wouldn't say it's the sole component, but, you know, on the one hand, these younger kids are a lot more authentic and there's a lot more acceptance of a lot of the different communities. But at the same time, there's still a lot of discrimination and that kind of thing. Like, there's still racism, there's still homophobia and all that kind of stuff. And from my point of view, there is kind of this increasing, I want to use the word violent, you know, what we hear is like young people being called rapists and that kind of thing. Like, it's very aggressive. It's not as kind of discreet anymore. They really get in your face about it. And, you know, even up where we practice, it's a small community and there's, you know, there's fights at school, things get physical, and that's taken outside of school as well. So then things that happen outside of school get brought into the school, and whose responsibility is it at that point to be mitigating these things? And kind of reflecting what was said before of what is the teacher's job? You know, is it the teacher's job to know how to handle these big accusations that get made and the students' mental health and all that kind of stuff? And if it's not, who's stepping in to fill that role? It's very uncertain. Yeah.
Thank you. Grant, from a ministry perspective, these results have been declining over the last 20 years or so, and there are a range of obviously challenges faced. And with a new government just taking the government benches in Parliament, how do you see this playing out, and what sort of interventions or what sort of approaches do you think? Because we're going to need to do something. This can't continue.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Just firstly, I want to acknowledge all those educationalists and schools and students who participated in PISA 2022. As you're aware, 2022 was a pretty challenging time for various reasons. There was COVID, but we've also had quite significant flooding events, etc. So it's really important that we acknowledge those that have participated. Also, just want to let everyone know that we have national reports that have been published, which have more New Zealand specific information in it, and that's available on Education Counts. And some of those questions that are coming up around, well, what does this mean? We'll delve into that a little bit more. As you can appreciate, yes, we've got a new government. To be fair, the timing of this publication and them getting into power, you know, the House has only just started this week. They have a 100-day plan, as you're aware. There's a couple of policies in there, and I note Andreas's comment around, you know, the culture, but also consistency, and there's certainly some of that's coming through in those policies that you can see, and there'll be more information about that as they get clearer about how those will roll out around the you know, hour of writing, literacy and math. So that will come through, and also they've got, as you're all well aware, the cell phone policy, which again, some of those results point to, as some of the comments have said. But I think at this stage, it's a bit of a wait and see. There is work around the curriculum as well happening, but we'll know more about that in the coming months.
Thank you. One of the questions that came up was the use of the digital devices, Andreas. A lot of talk in the pack around telephones, mobile phones, but did that also include tablets and the use of things like Chromebooks? Because those types of devices are also part of digital learning. And one of the questions was there a exploration as to the impact of those other devices, such as computers and calculators, rather than the smartphone distraction?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you have to make a clear distinction. Where we see technology used for learning, the effects are often positive. Where technology is used for leisure, and it's not the smartphone per se, it's when the smartphone is used for social media and things that have nothing to do with learning, really. And that's not a problem with your pocket calculator. Your pocket calculator is used for math. And I do think that's where the smartphone really has become a major distraction. And what, you know, I found most compelling in these results is that was not just about math performance, that those students do less well, but they showed higher levels of anxiety. They showed more social isolation. They showed less satisfaction with their life. So I do think education has got a real problem here. And those effects, by the way, are as strong as what we attribute to the COVID pandemic. So in a way, and they are permanent. The pandemic, you can say, is a one-off event, you know, probably things get back, but these things will remain with us, and schools have to grapple with this, and so do parents. So I think actually it's not about using technology for learning. That's where, you know, I think there are huge opportunities for quality, for equity, but it is the unregulated use of technology that teachers, you know, when you saw whether teachers have policies on this or schools have policies on this, it doesn't really make much of a difference. Students are not really adhering to this. It's really something I think that education in the years to come will have to take a serious look at. And, you know, with AI-based technology, some countries are very proactive on this. You know, if you go to Korea, kids now have digital tutors. It's actually really interesting. They are in the classroom. They all and the tutor that you have knows, you know, what you get interested in, what you get bored with, where you advance, where you get stuck, and they make your personal homework and all of this for you. But that, again, is technology for instructional use. The Koreans are actually quite good at avoiding the kind of destructive use of that.
Thank you. One of the questions that came in was there any correlation between the quality of the early childhood education or children having been in early childhood environments, be they kohanga, reo, or preschool, or some form of early childhood learning, and the impact that then has on scaffolding those children for success at school.
Absolutely. You know, unfortunately, we cannot measure the type and quality of early childhood experiences. We can just measure incidence and intensity, but that is very clearly related to outcomes later on at age 15. You can really see when those students who said, yes, I did participate in preschool, clearly have a performance advantage. The one caveat I want to make, and it's actually quite disturbing, is that you might hope that this will compensate for social disadvantage. That actually encourages children from disadvantaged backgrounds get a front start, a head start. But actually the results show a little bit the reverse. Parents seem to be quite good, the parents from wealthier backgrounds, to find the better early childhood education and care places, so that often we see actually a reinforcement of social backgrounds through early childhood education. But at the end, everybody has an advantage.
Bringing it up to all on the panel, we talked about the variability within the school. So the research as it currently stands indicates that there is not necessarily a huge disparity between the quality of the school's education across the country, but within each school there is a huge variability on the equitable access to education and what the students are actually achieving and deriving. Anyone care to comment on why they think that might be, or how we could address that to actually close that gap?
I'll raise a concern, I guess, I've got about that. It's a question more that comes out, you know, it's a deeper understanding. But a lot of this, and it relates back to Sana's comment about, you know, the teachers that she has. I mean, our schools are staffed, you know, by some pretty superb people, but we also know that many schools struggle to keep those numbers up, and so positions in schools are being filled by people perhaps who haven't had the right training and background for the position they're filling. And so although the statistics are showing, as Andrea said, our teacher to student ratios are there, they're not always necessarily with people who are qualified and prepared to teach in those areas. And I think for me there's a thing through the work that I do in schools specifically where I see just as big a range in the capability among teachers as there is among the achievement in students. And so that emphasis on professional development, on building the culture and recognising the need for supporting teachers to maintain and sustain their professional ability and capability becomes a real issue for me, alongside the connection with parents and community. I see that as another key plank in there.
Alana.
Jane, I think I'd like to make a couple of comments. Firstly, about the variation within schools, and I think a lot of that in our community is to do with the fact that if you say there's social disparity, well, there's a scale of that as well. So the readiness for learning is on a scale, and we're well aware of the variation of the achievement within our schools, and it is about resourcing. I just want to put that out there. But I also wanted to make the comment about the digital learning, because our community didn't wake up after COVID and realize that we have to go digital. We've been doing this for over 10 years. And good to hear that Korea is doing well, but we're doing well in our community as well with our digital learning, rewindable learning. Our staff are trained with that particular type of model of learning. But it's important to note that when you go on your digital learning journey, you have to take your community with you. You've got to take your families with you, because they too have to understand what that looks like and what it's about. So we're doing that in our community. And teachers, yes, big need of teachers in low socioeconomic communities. But the thing about that is we invest in our teachers so that they can uplift the learning of our young people and connect with their families. And then the unstableness of our school role causes our teacher numbers go down. And then, you know, you have to make a call about keeping all these teachers that you have invested in to enable the learning that they must do when they're there. So I think the digital thing is, from the lens that digital is here to stay. We have to look deeper into how we walk that journey, because it's far more deeper than banning a mobile phone. It is about bringing our community and our young people and teaching them the skills they need to do. And we've learned that in the 10 years that we've been doing digital learning here in our community in our Manaia Karani Kahuia. Thank you.
Grant.
I was just going to raise, so that was covered that, within our schools, we have a large, cross-section of attainment, and that reflects the school, communities across in relation to that, and then teachers obviously having to work with people at different levels. So how are we tracking that? So one of the things I just wanted to talk about is, we know there's a big drop off between year 4 and year 8. So the curriculum insight study which we're doing is now going to be looking at year 6, so we can try and get a better understanding of what might be happening in between time. And I think that's one of the challenges for us, is we know, as Derek has said, that there has been a consistent decline in our PISA results since it started. So what are some of those elements in there? And because we need to drill down more and understand more. So we're hoping that we'll have more information in the future to see if there's anything else we can look at there.
Excellent, thank you. Do any of the panelists wish to make one final comment? I'm just conscious of time.
I guess I'd just reinforce something I said before, and I really appreciate the work that Andreas and his team does in this regard. These are big trends, these are big issues, and as Grant has just identified, it's a case of drilling down and looking at the patterns and the drivers and the consequences and so forth, rather than just picking off little bits and interpreting it to our own ends.
Andreas, any final comments from you before we close?
Well, not really. I think that as Derek just said, I think these are the major challenges. I would not focus too much on the COVID pandemic. I really think much of what I've tried to show is really about structural issues in education. Can we actually get more responsibility, more activity to the front line? Can we combine a high degree of professional autonomy with a more collaborative culture, so that consistency comes from within the system? So I do think these are some very, very important questions, really. Can we align resources better with needs?
Kia ora. Thank you all for participating on the panel. It's been a good round discussion this morning, and the slides I'll now pass to Hannah. Thank you, Hannah.
And thank you, Andreas. Thank you for your time that you've spent, and obviously the extensive knowledge that you've brought into the conversation to help us really consider and think deeply about what this means for us in Aotearoa and New Zealand. And we're at a time where there's a lot of change going on, and there's more change afoot. And I think being able to have some of this data at our disposal while we engage in those conversations is critical. So for your generosity of your time to open that up to us and to open yourself up to these questions in the conversation this morning, our time, we thank you a lot. To the other panelists, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou, nā koutou I whakawāte I tō koutou wā, kia huitahi. So to our panelists who have joined today in this discussion, thank you so much. Time is a precious thing, and it is wonderful to have the leadership that you collectively bring into our conversation as we all work to advance the kaupapa that is out there to our hearts, which is the learning, the education, the opportunity and the equity for our learners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So on behalf of all of us, the recipients of your wonderful knowledge, nei rā te mihi atu kia koutou, thank you so much for your time. It is the privilege of EPIT, the Education Partnership and Innovation Trust. It is our privilege to be able to host this and to facilitate this conversation this morning. We are here to partner, we are here to help, and if there's anything we can do, please do not hesitate to make contact with us. Nā reira, ka manaakitaka ki ruki tēnā o koutou, o tātou, kia tau ka manaakitaka kia tātou. please, all the best wishes for the day, all the nights, depending on where you are in the world. And we hope that everyone goes forward and continues to do the work with all the strength that is required to do so. So on that, have a good morning. Nei rā te mihi atu kia koutou. Thank you so much. Hei konara.